Good morning and welcome to the 15th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. We have apologies this morning from Alison Harris. Can I welcome our new member, Gillian Martin, MSP, to the committee and thank Angela Constance for all her work. If I could invite Gillian to declare any relevant interests, please.
No interest to declare.
Thank you, Gillian. Agenda item 2 is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to agree that item 5 is taken in private. As we're on video conference, I'll assume everyone agrees unless anyone indicates otherwise. Okay, we are agreed. Our next item of business is our first evidence session on race equality, employment and skills inquiry. We have 2 panels. I'm very grateful to all witnesses for their attendance today. Can I welcome our witnesses on the first panel, Dave Black, General Manager, Grampian Regional Equality Council, Ruth Boyle, Policy and Parliamentary Officer, Close the Gap, Silence Johuri, CEO, Fair Justice System for Scotland Group, Laurie Hughes, Partnership and Communities Manager, PKAVS, Minority Communities Hub, and Dilraj Soki Watson, Co-Chief Executive Officer of Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre. Thank you all for being here today. We'll move to questions shortly. I'll remind members, if your question is addressed to a specific witness, please identify that witness by name. Otherwise, we'll work to the order in which witnesses appear on the agenda. Witnesses, if you have nothing to add in response to a question, please don't feel the need to speak and simply state that is the case. Ask everyone to allow broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question or to provide an answer. So if we can move to questions now. Race inequality has been brought back to the fore of people's minds with Black Lives Matter movement on the back of the police violence in the States and the evidence that we're seeing that COVID-19 is impacting disproportionately on Black and minority ethnic communities here. In terms of employment, in the short term, what do we need to do and how do we plan for the medium and longer term? And if I could go to Dave Black first, please. Dave.
Hi there. So I think a couple of things come to mind in your question. So one would be about data and having a clear picture of what the disparities are, what the inequalities are, because looking at ethnic minorities as a whole can sometimes not give a clear picture. So an example being the employment rates in the northeast of Scotland. African communities would face unemployment rates around 10% higher than the rest of the population, whereas ethnic minorities as a whole would be a fairly similar rate to the rest of the population. So I think, not suggesting that we need a big audit process or anything, but just to use the data that we've already got to actually make some targeted interventions rather than a kind of broad sweeping interventions. But I think the point is a good one about the focus that's there at the moment, and to make the most of that before that that kind of broader societal focus on this issue has dissipated. So really to make the most of this opportunity. Thank you.
It feels like comes up all the time, and there have been requests for better data collection and more targeted responses for a number of years. Why do you think it's not being got right yet?
It's a good question. I think there's a problem about the different terminology that's used in the different data collection processes. So you can have some organisations and institutions using very broad brush categories like Black, white, Asian, etc., and then you can have much more disaggregated data being collected, which on the whole is much more useful. But until we have a kind of streamlined approach to that, then I think it's always going to be a problem. We put a lot of emphasis in the Northeast and as an organisation in trying to collect the kind of big quantitative data that we can at a regional and local level, and then bringing that together with the local research that ourselves, other organisations like universities have been doing. and really trying to bring that together and identify priorities. And actually, it's a really effective tool to get organisations and kind of bigger institutions around the table and taking it seriously. So yeah, I'd suggest that at a kind of regional and local level, that might be a way forward. But just, I suppose, a caveat being, it's not been easy to get the data that we need to make that an effective kind of model.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to silence now, please?
Sure, thank you, convener. I think I do echo some of the sentiments which have been highlighted by Dev. I think perhaps I can just point out that there is now a very widely shared and rightly so perception that people are inquiry fatigued, people are evidence collection weary, because honestly, the evidence is there. I mean, the inquiries have been done for over the last 30 years or so. I mean, all you need to do one afternoon is just walk into the debating chamber of the Scottish Parliament and see how disturbingly, the symbol of Scottish democracy lags in diversity and equality. I mean, you only need to know that the capital city of Scotland, Edinburgh, is yet to register a single BME councillor among its ranks. I mean, the evidence, whether basic, whether specific or general, is abundantly there. I think what we need is, when we have processes like what we're having today, is to make sure they are followed up with practical, realistic, and encouraging measures that can instill confidence in the communities. Because some of these processes, they are now becoming almost like cover-ups, for institutions to be seen to be doing something about a problem which is historically urgently requiring to be addressed. I think you, in your opening remarks, convener, you did touch on the George Floyd issue and the Black Lives Matter protest. I think from my perspective and that of our organizations, those were simply some violent manifestations of, systemic, inherently deep-seated inequality that we have seen across the world. Here in Scotland, I think we are lucky that we haven't got to the levels that we are seeing in America in terms of the protest movement being as widely established and as viciously manifested as it is now in places like America. I think Scotland can actually stay ahead of that by setting the pace, in setting a clear and practically implemented and visibly achieved agenda on addressing equality. I mean, just coming back to your question, I think what we have seen as an organization is that some of the processes in place, like the criteria for recruitment, for example, some of these things were set maybe 30 years ago. There is maybe need to revisit the criteria in the recruitment process as a practical way of measuring, how we can achieve diversity and equality. And the other point I would just make in closing my remarks is that the apprentice system in Scotland, the apprenticeship system across the board, is so focused on young BME people. What about adult BME people? We have a very significant adult BME population in Scotland, which is still largely marginalized. These are people who are still actively employable, people who can still actively contribute to the economy, to the development of society, but there is no emphasis at all on addressing the inequality that these people still face. And there's also the last aspect, which is emphasis on supporting those in employment. We know that the figures of in-work BME people, they are not that significant. So how can we focus on supporting people who are just simply not there? We need to focus on getting them into the employment and then making sure they stay, because there's also a trend whereby once they start going up the steps, people that just fall out. They leave the professions, they come out of the work. Why are they not staying up there once they start going up? So those are some of the issues I think could be addressed.
Thank you. And I think the point that you make about sort of consultation fatigue is one that's very well made, and I think the committee absolutely acknowledges that. And we are keen in this inquiry to hold authorities to account. This isn't about the communities not doing enough. This is about the structures in Scotland doing more. And I know that colleagues will want to delve a bit deeper into some of the remarks that you made there as well. Can I go to Dilraj now, please, on my initial question about short, medium and long term, just that general point about what we need to do. Dilraj.
Mina, so I think in the short term, I'm coming from a gendered perspective because we work primarily with BME Muslim women here. I think in the short term, we would be looking at how COVID has impacted employability prospects amongst minorities. The evidence we've seen on the ground is that women are normally in part-time roles, and they normally are contracted, or they're more vulnerable with regards to the duration of their tenure and the terms of their contracts. So COVID has wreaked havoc on their financial stability, and also the fact that some are mums or some are caring roles, and they've had to step away from their roles, paid roles, to take on roles at home. So I think in the short term, we should certainly look at how COVID has changed the landscape with regards to employability, and also has affected women in particular, which there's evidence emerging that women are being disproportionately affected. So I'd like to see if there's some work that can be done there. In the medium term, I think I've raised this in our submission as well, which we submitted earlier, is much of the practices, and I'm coming from a point of view of a community organization. We do not primarily engage with public sector organizations when it comes to employment and employability, because that isn't in our landscape. So in the medium term, I think a real solution for us would be to actually have active engagement between community organizations who are working on employability measures or programs, and actually interact on outcome-based work as opposed to output-based work. So not about just, delivering training, but actually seeing how that training can then create progression opportunities for women, whether it's in the form of placements or whether it's in the form of internships. I also echo what Dave and Sans mentioned earlier about there's an absolute lack of disaggregated data around how ethnicities and gendered, how women are being affected in the short and long term. In our experience, when we work with women through our employability program, what we've noticed is they've had enough training, they've had enough capacity building, but there's always seems to be some sort of a bottleneck at the point when they need to be recruited. So a bit more clarity on how many of public sector organizations, how many people are actually applying. It's not so much about let's encourage young or older BME folk to apply for these jobs, but actually seeing how many are applying, and the ones who aren't, why are they not making it through the first stage of their recruitment process? So I think more light needs to be shown on that element rather than just say, let's just train people and just apply for these jobs. Long term, I do have quite a few views on what we can do. Part of that is actually looking at an outcome-based approach, which Scotland, I think, is, we talk about the ACE approach to training. I don't know if it is actually one of the first countries in the world which is looking at this methodology, where we're looking at a lot of historic baggage, for want of a better word, which impacts people's ability to progress in life. And when you start unpacking the gendered and the kind of race impact on young women and young girls, and what are the kind of inherent disadvantages they've experienced, and how they are preventing those disadvantages are preventing these young people and then older women to kind of progress. I think when we look at training packages in the long term, we start looking at, not just a kind of demand focus, well, let's just kind of, add people, but actually look at where where do they sit in that space, and what is it that we can do to pull out their strengths? And just to summarize, to kind of conclude, we've recently also seen, I mentioned care, we've seen a significant rise in the number of women who have had to take on caring roles during COVID. And one of the things that have come through is, given the way minority ethnic spaces work with regards to family regimes and how women take on caring roles, unpaid caring roles, a number of women feel that having done those roles for so long, when they do want to get into employment, they basically have nothing to go on, and all of that work they've put in their households really don't count as experience. So actually thinking of life experiences, life skills which can then be applied to job kind of spaces. So yeah, that would be my kind of insight to your question.
Thank you. Laurie, can I come to you now, please?
Good morning. Thank you, convener. I think for us, one of the issues, well, I echo much of what's already been said in terms of disaggregated data, in terms of consultation fatigue, in terms of wanting to move to a more outcome-focused approach. I think for us, one of the things I would like to add in there is that the ethnic minority demographics in Perth and Kinross are largely Eastern European. And I think one of our concerns certainly is that non-visible minorities are perhaps not taken enough into consideration. I would also add that, and convener, you mentioned structures and institutions. I think one of the things that we as a hub certainly have felt during the COVID response that we've had in Cooper Angus is that it has demonstrated to us that everything is so focused on geography and locality in terms of solving our solutions, whereas actually the communities that we work with, their connections are through a community of interest. So if any response is based on that kind of geographic approach about people being defined by boundaries, and that is who they connect with, their neighbours within, say, Blair Gowrie as an area, for example. What we've learned during COVID and what we knew beforehand is that actually the communities that we work with identify as a community in terms of a Romanian woman living in Carnoustie, where I am, maybe have more of an affiliation and closer connection with a Romanian woman living in Cooper Angus, and they might identify that as their community, that is their source of support. Whereas if everything is based on kind of a regional or geographic basis, then those two structures are not going to align. So I think that's something we need to take into consideration when we're creating strategies and plans. Obviously, we want them to be co-produced as much as possible, but I think to embed that commitment to fairness and dignity, we need to reflect the structures and the relationships that are already within the communities and not expect people to define and live by ones that we are imposing if that was done geographically.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Can I come to Ruth Boyle now, please, Ruth?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to come along and give evidence today. As you said, COVID-19 has really highlighted the pre-existing inequalities that existed within the Scottish labour market. And in Close the Gap published some research called Disproportionate Disruption that concluded that women's employment would be disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 job disruption. But that research also found some specific findings around BME women. So we know that BME women are more likely to be working in a sector that's been shut down during the crisis, or more likely to be in insecure work, which puts them at greater risk of loss of hours and earnings, and that BME women are concentrated in low-paid service sectors that are more susceptible to redundancies over the course of the crisis. And indeed, those service sectors such as retail and hospitality are less likely to bounce back at the end of the crisis because of changing consumer preferences and lower consumer spending power, which means that the impact on BME women's employment in those sectors is unlikely to be fleeting. Because of BME women's concentration in low-paid work, receiving 80% of their income through the job retention scheme also has the potential to push more BME women into poverty, and BME women were already at disproportionate risk of experiencing poverty and in-work poverty as well. So that's kind of the evidence that we have around what the impacts have been for Black and minority ethnic women. In terms of what can be done about that, I think the most important point is that there's no deprioritisation of equalities work by the Scottish Government. And indeed, this inquiry is even more important than it was when it was first announced because of those impacts. The actions that Scottish Government can take as a starting point is around integrating gender sensitive data analysis, including intersectional gender data, into economic recovery responses and also labour market policy making. We would like to see gender mainstreaming and race mainstreaming into all labour market policy making as standard. I think there's also a need for interventions designed to tackle women's rising unemployment and BME women's rising unemployment, with some targeted interventions, as other panellists have highlighted, to tackle BME people's inequalities specifically. I think there's also a need within the response to think about how we can have better accountability mechanisms and have implementation of the frameworks that already exist. So I know there's been some highlighted evidence already around the lack of accountability mechanisms that have been integrated into the Race Equality Action Plan and the Race Equality Framework. So it is really about making sure that the actions within those frameworks are already being implemented and pushing forward on that existing framework. The same would apply to the public sector equality duty, which we know hasn't resulted in the transformational change that was intended. So it's definitely about looking at how these existing interventions can be improved. And I know the Scottish Government do have plans to have a review and potential reform of the Scotland-specific duties under PSED. I think just to echo the point on data, which I don't think can be made often enough, we really have a lack of data, particularly on intersectional issues. So we don't have a lot of data about, as Dilraj says, the experience of BME women within the labour market. And there's also actions that employers should be taking around improving their employment practice. And I think, as you said, the emphasis really has to be on demand side interventions. So looking at what employers can be doing to improve their employment practice across recruitment, training and development, and their general workplace culture as well. To end on a more positive note, we held an engagement event with BME women in June, which Dilraj attended actually, which was to look at recommendations to respond to the problems that arose from Close the Gap's original research, Still Not Visible. And in that event, there was a lot of frustration from the participants that this agenda hadn't been furthered, that there hadn't been enough action, that there wasn't that accountability mechanisms. But there was also a little bit of optimism that the current context does provide an opportunity to push for substantive action. So COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to do things differently. And also the emphasis on the Black Lives Matter movement, as you said, is maybe starting to make employers think that they do have a role in terms of furthering equality for BME groups in Scotland as well.
Thank you very much. Can I now go to Fulton McGregor, please, Fulton?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I know it's been touched on by other speakers here, including Ruth just there, but I want to ask more about institutional racism, especially given all the actions that's in the Race Equality Framework to increase number of minority ethnic people in employment. What role do you, as panel members, think that institutional racism plays in employment, and how do we begin to address it? And I'm wondering, do you agree with what Claire told us, that in many ways we are coming at it from by trying to understand the deficiency has been within the minority communities rather than named as an issue within employment organisations?
Can we go to Dave for reflections on that, please, Dave?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the role of institutional racism is something that's obviously, yeah, as you say, been a focus of the last few months. And I think there's still a lot more discussion to be had there about about what that means for organisations, I think there is too much focus on looking at the outcomes for people and not enough focus on kind of internally looking at what an organisation does and how its culture prevents people from either entering in the first place or staying in the organisation or rising to the top of the organisation. I think there's been a kind of culture of taken for granted that racism, in terms of overt racism, isn't a problem within an organisation, and therefore kind of laziness about the issue of equality. And I think that's across all sectors. I think there needs to be something more systematic in place that does challenge organisations or require organisations to be more proactive around that, around challenging themselves to look at how their processes are a kind of built into the culture that we live in. They're a product of our history, and as we've been speaking about over the last few months, that's a complex history and often a not very pretty history. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I think on the question of whether there's too much emphasis on individuals' outcomes, I think for sure. I'm not sure without some kind of broader systematic approach to it that the emphasis on companies is really going to make a big difference, because I think we'll just end up with some good companies, a few good companies that do take that proactive approach, but still with many companies that they'll just do the bare minimum. And I think there's also a risk of exploitation at the moment. We're hearing some cases of people returning from furlough and not being paid their full wages because their employers telling them that some of their money has to be paid back to the government in relation to the furlough scheme. This year we've also seen cases of employees not being paid minimum wage. Just the same issues that have been there for many years. So I think it's also about being aware that there's some really basic issues that need to be addressed, as well as these more systemic and structural issues as well.
Thank you. Can I bring in silence on Fulton's question there, please? Silence.
I think my take on that, Fulton, is that it will be very brief. I think institutional racism is something that was brought to the fore for the first time through the Stephen Lawrence report. I think that's when it was highlighted as something that existed as a problem. But we are talking almost 20 years now. And over the years, there have been attempts to try and dilute that, to dispel it as a myth, to say it doesn't exist. I think we've had some very high-profile individuals whom I wouldn't name at the moment making those sort of comments to say nothing like institutional racism exists or it's not a problem. I think what we need is to have acknowledgement at the highest possible level from the Scottish Government, for example, the Scottish Parliament, and all our public institutions such as the local authorities, acknowledging that institutional racism is a problem. It does exist. It's still very much alive. If we get that sort of high-level acknowledgement, I think that's the first point in reviving the perception around this problem. Because if we don't admit that we have a problem, it's very difficult to find solutions for something that doesn't exist as a problem. So that's the starting point. And just to wind up my point on that, we have seen a situation whereby we have something of a chicken and egg situation, whereby the organizations that are taking advantage of their systems that are not inclusive, I mean, they always throw the ball back at the marginalized communities, saying that, for example, we don't get enough applications from BME communities. That's why we don't have many BME people within our employment ranks. Or to say the reason why we are not addressing this problem, which is affecting, the aspirations and prospects of BME communities is that we never realized there was a problem. I think what we need to do is to make sure that public bodies, they face the same kind of penalties when they fail on their Section 146 obligations. I think we have seen it in the financial services industry. Post the 2008 financial crisis, the penalties around GDPR and the GPA legislation and regulations, whereby companies breach their GDPR obligations, the penalties they face, percentages of their annual turnovers, individuals in senior management facing possible, jail terms. The criminal liability aspect is something that is reformed, those other sectors. We need to see that replicated when it comes to the Equality Act 2010, Section 146, public duty obligations, whereby when public officials fail on their public duty to make their organizations inclusive, they have to face those sort of stiff penalties. I think organizations also have to face the same stiff penalties when they fail on their public duty obligations. I think that's the only way where we can see anything that is linked to institutional racism being radically addressed.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Dilraj? Dilraj.
Thank you, convener. I think for us, there's two sides to it. One is organizations viewing themselves as not having any agency because they're one organization within a sector which is inherently, systematically stacked against minority ethnic communities. So in our kind of experience, we've actually come across examples where organizations have said, there's nothing much we can do about inequalities in our practices because the sector itself is inherently unequal. So for me, that itself is not recognizing that we are part of that system and start taking action as individuals rather than being, putting it back to the system. That's one issue. The other is that the labor market is competitive. There's no two doubts about that. And when you start looking at recruitment practices and you're looking at opening up these jobs for across the board, with BME folks and women, BME women, having inherent disadvantages which have come across time, it's very difficult for them to be as competitive as others to be viable candidates for organizations which are recruiting. So I think it's about recognizing that the labor market is competitive. So it's all well to train people. But if the market itself is competitive, then people do get left behind. For example, with BME women, there's an absence of BME women in senior positions across public sector organizations. When you don't have senior role models in place, those practices then are not kind of built into those organizations and kind of permeated. And that's just one example. So if you don't see somebody who's similar to you within the organization or at the higher levels of the organization, then you feel that organization is not for you, and the understanding to bring in people from that particular demographic is absent. However much we are empathetic to the idea that we need to be diverse, if we've not experienced or we're not aware or we're not in that space, then we're not going to be recognizing it. So that for us is a key issue. I think there was another question earlier on about, sorry, I missed the question right in the beginning. There's a question in this, and I wanted to answer that and I've forgotten. Could you please repeat the question, Mr. McGregor? You'd asked.
Is it in relation to what Claire had told the committee?
Yes.
Are we coming at it from the wrong way? By understanding the deficiencies within minority communities as opposed to within organisations? Was that the part?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, that's what I was referencing to. Yes, I agree with Claire, because BME communities or BME women are overcapacity built. We've already got the capacity, so it's not about deficiencies in that particular pool. It's about recognizing that organizations are deficient in their recruitment practices and kind of putting the lens inwards. So yes, in short, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose I would want to just say on behalf of the committee that we are very focused on holding the employers in particular. We're looking at public sector employers in this to account, and we're clear that it's not about Black and minority ethnic communities' deficiencies at all. It's about the structures in Scotland that we do need to change. Laurie, can I bring you in on Fulton's questions, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I agree with the statement made by Claire. I think the framing of something like this is very important. I personally feel, is it an equality issue or is it an inequality issue? Because depending on how we frame that would make a big difference as to how we respond to it. I think that the power and the significance of that should not be overlooked. I think there is echoing some of the thoughts the remarks that Dave and Silas both made earlier about there not being a problem here. We are open and inclusive as an employer is something that we regularly hear. But I think for me, one of the questions that I would ask or I would challenge is whose responsibility is it? If you have a local authority where there is one individual for that local authority whose job is to focus on equalities, how is that possible? How can that one person be responsible for ensuring that everything that local authority does meets equalities criteria? I think then it's that issue with whose problem is it? Is it one person's problem? Is it everybody's problem? Or by that nature, does it make it nobody's problem? And I think we need to have greater focus on that. But I think one thing that I would add anecdotally is that so we've spoken about Black Lives Matter and how that might have given an opportunity to do something now to capitalise on that momentum and that feeling that's there. But I participated in a conversation where there was a comment made about, but it might pass. There are concerns. I have quite deep rooted concerns about some of those issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Laurie. And Ruth, please.
Thank you. Yes, so I think the demand side and supply side intervention point is something that Close the Gap focus on a lot, and we would support Claire's analysis that it really has to be focusing on institutional racism. Kaliani Lyle, when she was Independent Race Equality Advisor, also highlighted that there was a need for more of a focus on demand side interventions, because focusing on supply side, as you say, kind of implies that there is a deficit amongst BME women rather than the system being stacked against them. So in response to Mr. McGregor's question, then I think that institutional and structural racism is the barrier and the thing that should be focused on. When we look at the findings of our Still Not Visible research, which was done and published last year, and we did some primary research with BME women as part of that, we found that 72% of our respondents had experienced racism, racial discrimination, racial prejudice or bias in the workplace. 47% of our respondents felt that they had been discriminated against when applying for a job, and 49% felt that they were overlooked for a development opportunity within their workplace because of racism or racial prejudice. So I think it's clear that that is about the system and the lack of action on behalf of employers to improve their negative employment practice and to tackle negative and potentially racist workplace cultures within their workplace as well. There's a term that Inclusion Scotland use around employerability as opposed to employability. And I think that's really the key point, is about what employers can do to recruit and retain BME women, rather than the emphasis being on improving applications for BME women, for example. I think just to pick up on one of the questions that was in the consultation document around recruitment. So again, to return to our findings, as I said, 47% felt they were discriminated against when applying for a job, and 41% felt that they were discriminated against at interview stage. And a lot of women in our focus group said that when they were struggling to get a job, they felt like their only option was to return to education and to try and upskill themselves. But then when they went back to applying for jobs, they were still not managing to secure good quality employment. I think that kind of highlights that for BME people, the correlation between higher educational outcomes doesn't exist with better labour market outcomes. And therefore, it's really about changing what employers can do. And one of the telling findings from our recruitment section of the report is around language. And there was this idea that the barrier around language, rather than it being a genuine skills deficit on behalf of BME women, because indeed English language skills is an issue for a small proportion of the BME community, so migrants, and it's also correlated with older migrants as well. But language was seen as almost a universal barrier for women, not because of a genuine skills deficit, but because of the discrimination and bias on behalf of employers. So BME women felt that they were always going to be marked as a non-native English speaker by their name or because of their accent. So again, that's all about employer discrimination rather than there being any skills deficit. And I think...
Sorry to interrupt you there. It was just to say, I know that Gillian Martin's going to come in with some questions around recruitment, so we'll delve into
Okay, perfect. That's what I was going to go on to. If I could just make one final point, just around the point that's been made around voluntary action, and what we see from work with employers and across the labour market is that employers are still very, very reluctant to take voluntary action on equalities issues in the workplace. And then there really often has to be a legal obligation for employers to prioritise work on equalities, and there's lots of examples to demonstrate that. So, for example, the new gender pay gap reporting regulations, the fatal flaw of those regulations is that employers are not required to take any action, and therefore they're not. So while employers are reporting their gender pay gap figure, they're not taking any actions. So less than a third actually published any actions as to how they were going to close their gender pay gap, and only 6% published any targets. So we really see that there's still employer complacency and reluctance to prioritise equality in their practices.
Thank you, that's helpful. And we spoke a lot there about accountability, which brings you nicely to Mary Fee's line of questioning. Mary. Sorry, Mary, your mic's not on yet. Hold on. Just don't do anything. We'll just broadcasting will hopefully. Okay, I think we'll suspend briefly there for a couple of minutes while we work out what's happening with the microphones. If we could suspend, please. Hey, welcome back. We seem to have managed to sort that problem. It's a very relaxing format, this, for everyone, I know. So thank you for your patience. Mary Fee, we were coming to you for your questions. Mary.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to all of our panel. There's a couple of questions I would like to get the panel's views on. And the first is that the committee are planning to hold a partnership accountability event where public authorities, stakeholders in the committee can get together and public authorities can talk about what progress they have made and what actions they are taking, and it gives the committee and stakeholders an opportunity to ask public authorities questions on progress and what they're doing. And I'd be keen to hear the panel's views on whether or not they think such events are beneficial. And if they are, is there a specific focus we should be putting onto those partnership accountability events? And the second question I would like to ask the panel is, given the very mixed picture from across public authorities in helping people from minority ethnic communities move into the workplace, progress has been quite slow. Does the panel have any advice that would help public authorities encourage diversity in the workplace?
Thank you, Mary. Can I go to Dave Black first, please? Dave.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah, I think in terms of the accountability events, it sounds like there would be a place for something like that, but I think to be beneficial, it has to kind of sit alongside a stronger enforcement system around things like the Equality Act, which I think Silence and others have mentioned already. I mean, looking at the type of funding and resource and capacity that enforcement bodies had before the Equality Act came into force, you know, organisations that were just focused on race equality and gender equality and disability and discrimination, you know, I believe all those organisations had more capacity and resource than the whole of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And you know, I'm sure that there's a willingness and a keenness from the EHRC to be doing more, but it's not an organisation that you know we hear from often. It feels like their capacity to take on cases is quite limited. In that, you know, they have to be particularly aligned with their strategic objectives, well, that's my understanding anyway of the current situation. And without that kind of, yeah, to some extent fear for employers, and including public sector employers and organisations, that, you know, they are going to be held accountable, and it's not just going to be, you know, an email with a bit of a telling off. It's going to be, you know, properly held to account. Then I don't think there will be real change. I think that the type of event that you're speaking about, that's more public, that maybe allows more community involvement in that, I think you know, that would be a good addition to what you know, a more broader approach to enforcement and a more systematic approach. Yeah, and I'll let other people come in on the second question if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to Silence now, please?
Oh, thank you, convener. I think these are two very important questions, Mary. I can never overemphasize how important those questions are, because they are very much touching on the issues we have been talking about, both historically and where we would like Scotland to be today. Just going to your first question, those events should be useful. But I think from our experience so far, they have not been useful, those type of events. So my advice, which I think is well shared within our organization, I think some of you would have seen our report, which we have done. I didn't want to speak much about that because this is not about specifically our report. It's about general issues we are talking about. But if you have those events, I think, and bring those public bodies, I think go to them with specific asks. Don't allow them to tell you how much they are doing which is not evidenced by anything from the outlook of their staff complement, from the outlook of their governance structures, from the outlook of their executive structures. I mean, the senior management, CEO and senior and middle management. I mean, don't allow them to wriggle out. I think go there and be very clear. Tell them that the time for you guys to come and tell us about how much you're doing, how much you're spending on these, how many organizations you're working on. It's no longer an input-based approach. It's an outcome-based approach. We call it the headcount approach. I mean, if you look at this panel this morning, you can see there is diversity on this panel because of the outlook of the panel. That's what we want to see within those organizations. They can no longer talk about how much they are doing, how much they are spending, and how much they are reaching out. The other point I want to make on that specific issue as well is that recruitment policy is not a community outreach or a community engagement issue. I mean, a lot of these organizations, they hide behind what they are doing to engage the community as a way of substituting what they should be doing on their own recruitment policy. I think it's a policy matter. I've done this work myself. I came from the community background. I did a lot of community work, but I realized that that's not where we change these issues. We change them when you start engaging at the policy level. And then the last question you have asked is about the role, I think if I got it correct, local authorities could play. Maybe that was the question. But the answer to that is, I'll give you an example. We have done something for COSLA. I think COSLA, for those of you who are aware, is the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. It's the umbrella body of Scottish local authorities. They bring together all of them. We have done a report for them to just highlight to them to say, of the 32 or so local authorities in Scotland, they have about 1,100 something councillors between them. And out of that 1,000 plus councillors, only 9 of them are from a BME background. I mean, that's how staggering it is. So organizations like COSLA, they can play a very, very important role in bringing, real-time, requirements or recommendations to local authorities in terms of how they can change their recruitment practices, even when they are doing the election campaigns for councillors. I think they need to make sure that other options like independent councillors, they need to be encouraged. People have to be encouraged and told that they can actually stand as independent councillors if the political parties are not creating that sort of space. Because we need to have, across the layers of the structures of these organizations. Yeah, so that's my answer to that. I mean, I could have said a lot more, but I need to give other people time as well to speak.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Can I go to Dilraj now, please?
Thank you. So for me, what would be useful to know is what is the partnership accountability event hoping to achieve? I think it's a good start, but what are we? My starting point would be, what are we hoping to get out of this event? Is this a high-level conversation on what do we do on next steps, or is it actually action plans on what we do? How do we kind of take those forward?
I wonder if it would be helpful if I jumped in for a second. Mary's question is about this committee's approach to our inquiry. So what we would hope to do would be to have an accountability event where instead of having just panels where we ask questions, perhaps even the same questions that have been asked in previous inquiries, that we have a more dynamic event where we hold the public authorities and the bodies to account for those outcomes that you talk about, for those outputs, and involve stakeholders as well. So what we're aiming to do is to shine a light on outcomes and what the picture is really there, rather than what people are doing at the moment. That's helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, that clears it. I think in that context, accountability would not be, for me, that itself is a very strong word and would put public authorities off from the word go. So it's about looking at how public authorities can work on this, and having identified a lot of issues with the way recruitment and structural issues are, persistent. For me, it's not just about holding them accountable, but progressing from what we learned. So not just kind of not wanting to use the word lynch, but not saying, okay, we are not doing this, but about saying, okay, what is it that we can do from kind of moving forward? That would be my kind of take on this. Action plan. Yes, absolutely. I think this event would be very useful, but for it to be really impactful, an action plan should arise out of it. So yes, we identify the gaps. Yes, we see these are the areas we need to put more input, but actually have them as measurable, impactful actions, because that's when we can hold them accountable. Otherwise, it'll just be another high-level event. So that's the first thing I'd like to see out of that. The second would be this would be organizations like we work in, and I can't speak for others, but we normally don't engage with public sector organizations on recruitment and employability, because that is almost out of reach for the demographic we work with. So for organizations like Amina, this would be a good opportunity to, and others as well, I'm sure, would be a good opportunity to be in the same space as public sector organizations and have an honest conversation as this is what we have to say, and this is what you're doing. So I think that space would be really welcome. In terms of going forward from that event, I would say also have some sort of deadlines and reviews. And if we agree on actions, let's have a look how far we've come on these few months, few years, whatever timelines are agreed or set on. So that would be my kind of take on the first part of the question. In terms of mixed picture across BME recruitment and progress in recruitment, a high-level response to that would be looking at recruitment practices and functions across public sector organizations, not just recruitment, but also training. And this is something we've already spoken about: training of staff across different functions, training of senior, but also looking at what does that training mean, not just about making people aware that this is our PSED, this is what we need to do, but what are we taking from that training, and how are we actually, I think, measuring the impact, looking at the outcome of that training rather than saying this is what the training is. The other would be a bit more transparency in recruitment practices, whether it's in the form of reporting, whether it's in the form of disaggregated data, how that's mapped. I'm not very familiar with the legalese and policy aspects of that, but I think a bit more transparency on recruitment practices would be helpful, because then that will help us identify which are the people who are not even making through the front, the first line, and see how we can support them to move forward.
Thank you. I suppose I would reflect on those comments that these public sector authorities are bodies are accountable to our citizens in Scotland, but I would also say that this committee would never do any ambushing. We would always aim to work in a cooperative and helpful way, but I think we do have to be clear that they are accountable to our communities here in Scotland. Can I ask Laurie for her reflections on Mary's questions, please, Laurie?
Yeah, thank you. I would be sceptical actually about that approach. I think in that type of setup, local authorities are going to tell you what you want to hear. So I would question the authenticity of that. I think if they are given the time and kind of a run up to something, an event such as that, then they're going to project what they want to project. They're going to portray a certain way. And the other thing I would add to that is that for the likes of ourselves, if we were part of a meeting or a situation like that, you would also be asking organisations who perhaps receive funding from a local authority to then be questioning that local authority. So I think we would need to take that into consideration, that some of us are commissioned to deliver services and what the implications of that might be in terms of biting the hand that feeds you, essentially. And we would need to consider the format in terms of accessibility for communities and stakeholders as well. In terms of Mary's second question about how to encourage diversity in the workplace, I think Dilraj touched on it previously. I think you can do all the work that you want to do around recruitment practices and policies, but it's about changing that culture. It needs to be a workplace that people identify as somewhere that's for me. And until we're able to change that, I don't know how much impact that genuinely would have. I think work around using different languages, I think, would certainly be advantageous. Again, how things are framed in our consultation response, the survey that we did, fair treatment was what attracted people. They wanted fair treatment and to be able to be somewhere that they are respected and accepted for who they are. So again, I don't think there's any policy or practice that you could put in place to make that happen. To me, that's more of an organisational culture shift that's required.
Thank you, Laurie. I think your point about organisations questioning those who fund them is well made, and we will take that on board. Can we go to Ruth Boyle now, please?
Yeah, so I think to echo some of the cynicism that has been raised already, that I don't think a transparency event would be a silver bullet and it means that these organisations are all of a sudden going to be prioritising equality. But I do think that there's a role for greater transparency, particularly if at those events you were encouraging senior leaders from these public bodies to come and to be questioned. What we see is, it's been raised earlier today, that there's often one person within an organisation who is working on the public sector equality duty and is supposed to be doing all of the organisation's equalities work. But what we know is that only senior leaders and strong leadership will change negative workplace cultures. So I think if you were encouraging senior leaders from these organisations to come along and to be questioned on what they're doing on equality, that would be useful in terms of highlighting that this is an organisational wide problem and needs to be prioritised by all of the leaders within that organisation. I think that perhaps this comes from a point that was raised by Sembo, highlighting that there needs to be this accountability. And I think they raised in their written submission that if we were going to do something like this, it couldn't just be a one-off tick box exercise, but rather it would be very useful to have these organisations coming back in 6 months' time or 12 months' time to highlight what action they've taken since they were last questioned on this. Because as I've raised previously, unless there's that accountability or legal obligation, we know that employers do not prioritise equality. So I think it would be useful for the organisations to know that this is not just a one-off event. I think from our engagement event with BME Women, they did highlight that transparency was a key consideration for them, both in terms of what the Scottish Government were doing on race equality, but also in terms of what their individual employer is doing. And that transparency can really help to build trust with individuals, seeing that the issues that they're raising are being taken seriously and the organisations are taking some action. Women who participated in the event highlighted that often organisations will survey them and ask what changes they want to see and then go away and do those changes in private. And there's never any updates on what changes we're taking or whether those changes have been successful. So I think that's a really important point as well. And the women who participated in that event did highlight that that transparency point has to be coupled with greater accountability. So I think there will be some caveats to that event, but I do think that that would be a useful thing for the committee to do. In terms of what public bodies can do to further equality, there's a range of actions that they can take, and I think that the point that's been raised around changing workplace cultures is the pivotal point. So again, that strong leadership and consulting your staff around the types of changes that they would like to see in the workplace is really important. Having clear discrimination and harassment policies, and making sure that your employees are aware of those policies and feel comfortable using them is really important. And finally, just on public bodies, obviously the public sector equality duty that I've raised previously, a key point that public bodies could take would be to prioritise the public sector equality duty and to be fulfilling their obligations under that, because we know at the minute that there's been a regression in compliance with that duty, and it's not operating as intended.
Thank you.
Ruth. I think the points about who's accountable are very important, and certainly as a committee, we're fully aware that the diversity and inclusion officer doesn't have the ultimate responsibility for that it would be chief executives and senior directors. Now, I see I have a couple of requests to speak from the panel, but we're actually very tight for time, and there are another couple of questions that I want to get members in with. So if we have time at the end, I will come back into you, but it's important we bring in, touch on some of these other points. So Gillian Martin now, please.
Thank you, Convener. A lot of you have touched on positive action that's been taken, and I'm very conscious that I'm very struck by the comment from Silence about certain things seems to be cover-ups, to be seen to be doing something, checkbox exercises. There's positive action has been used, for years and years and years, but they don't seem to be working. And I'd like to ask the panel why they think that is, but also at the back of that, I'm aware of there's specialists that are often brought in to look at recruitment practices with a gendered lens. And if I were in that position in a public body and seeing that what I was doing wasn't working, the first thing I would do would be I'd be getting on to organisations like yourselves and asking you to come in and look at my practices and do an assessment on why they aren't working. And look at things like, how many people from BAME backgrounds apply for jobs and how many make it through to successful recruitment. And if that's disproportionate or not working, I would want to ask you what I'm doing wrong. So first of all, what's working, what's not working? Why are public bodies, why is the progress so slow? But have any of you ever been asked to do any of that kind of assessment? Have you been invited in to look at what's going wrong?
Okay, can I go to Dave on that first? Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that, the last question is quite an easy one to answer, so I'll start with that one. So in terms of public bodies, no, I don't think we've ever been asked to come in and look at recruitment practice. Particularly, it's something that maybe from the third sector and even the private sector, we've had organisations approach us. But I would say in the public sector, no. On the point about positive action having been done but not seeming to work, I would actually, in my experience, I haven't really seen, I don't think, positive action used to the full extent that it could be. I hear organisations like PATH who do work and focused on housing and employment within the housing sector, speak very passionately about the benefits of the programmes that they deliver and the positive outcomes that that's had. I don't actually think that positive action is understood properly by public authorities and other organisations, and I don't think it is being used to its full extent that the legislation allows. Going back a little bit, I suppose, to touch on the last question as well, but linking to this one, I think, Silence made a point that recruitment isn't a community engagement exercise, but I think part of the problem with the way that local authorities and public bodies approach the Equality Act and the specific duties is that it's become a tick box exercise, and it's also become completely disconnected from communities in some circumstances, in some cases, and actually, that lack of knowledge, that lack of connection, which, maybe local authorities used to have, I think decreasingly they don't have that anymore, and they don't have those relationships where they can go and ask, or they can go and say, we're recruiting, we're not getting applications, where can we advertise? Is there someone who can champion this or push this out? Who's the key people to speak to? We've got some very positive relationships and work going up here in the North East, but not with all local authorities. And so, I think going back, I suppose, to that question about what I would ask local authorities at that kind of event is, how do you understand what's going on in communities? How do you know what the reality is? And I think that does have an impact on the success or otherwise of recruitment exercises. Thanks.
Thank you. And if I'll just note that when we're talking about public authorities, we don't just mean the local authorities, we mean all public bodies in Scotland. Silence, can I come to you now for your answers to Gillian's questions, please?
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thank you, Gillian, for asking those two questions again. I think they're very important questions. I'll just agree with Dave there on the aspect of positive action not being adequately articulated. I think it needs to be revisited as a concept. It needs to be articulated, I think, more robustly, and especially highlighting some of the positives that can come out of having such a concept, implemented as vigorously as it should. I think the other issue I wanted to touch on as well is in terms of local authorities. Most of them, they seem to be auditing themselves. So this is a very important question, that especially when you do those engagement exercises, I think you need to also highlight to the local authorities how are they auditing their internal processes, because most of them, they are actually depending on their own internal systems. They are accountable to themselves, which I don't think it will help them to achieve much. They need to be open to outside scrutiny. They can also, to follow on Jeff's point, this is where I think the community engagement could benefit from a scrutiny and auditing point of view. They can use the community organizations to provide them feedback. But when they are provided with this feedback, they shouldn't just take it and throw it into some pigeon box or without using it. I think they should take it on the chin. They should try, not necessarily wholesale, but implement some of the key aspects of that feedback. I think we have had a lot of these exercises, but I think it's the follow-on, the next steps after those exercises, which is being lost in translation. I think the other point I was going to make as well is that equality and diversity officers within most of these organizations, they are more of implementation officers. They are just implementing what is being dropped on their laps from the top. They don't have a significant input into those processes. So we talk about the will and the power to get things done. We have officials in organizations who have the will to get things done, but they don't have the power. I think it's high time we combine a little bit of the will and a little bit of the power. Give these officers, the equality and diversity officers, more power, to formulate rather than just to implement policy. I think that could be a very good turning point. And then the other point that Gillian touched on, if I got it correct, she said what should be done by the local authorities themselves. Why are these things not working so far? Again, I'll go back to my point to say, instead of looking at recruitment as something that can be a pipeline process, to say at some point it's going to happen, at some point we'll have BME people within our staff complement. It's not going to happen like that. They have to really approach it from a very different angle.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we have 3 more panel members to go to and questions from 2 more MSPs. So can I make a plea for brevity in answers? I know it's a really important topic and we value what you have to say, but I really want to be able to get through everybody. Can I go to Dilraj, please?
Thank you, Ruth. So what's working is good practice reporting. So all procedural, we're doing this, we're doing that, and we're reporting on that. So that's really working. And what's not working is that the good practice activities in Scotland, at least, focus on outputs as opposed to outcomes, which I mentioned previously as well. I think for me, the solution would look like is if these practice reporting is actually tied to the data when it comes to recruitment. So almost like a circular kind of view of where are we going wrong, as opposed to saying this is what we're doing and this is what this is the training we've done, this is the awareness we've raised. But if we start looking at the recruitment numbers, or if we look at attrition numbers, or if we look at lack of progression numbers, when we start looking at the duties in that context, I think that's when we'll be able to see impact within public sector organization in the context of BME recruitment and progression. That would be my response.
Thank you very much. Laurie, can I come to you now, please?
Yeah, I think when we speak about positive action in housing is the one that springs to mind for the vast majority of us, I think. I personally feel that it's perhaps not used widely enough because there's a fear, like Silence spoke about will and power. I think there's a fear of how will this be perceived, or concern about how that will be portrayed to your average white middle class male on the street. I think there's concerns wrapped around that. In terms of have we ever been invited to support with or to reflect on recruitment practices, etc. Not to my knowledge, but I think that's part of a bigger issue around parity of esteem and where power is held. I don't think that the third sector is held on an equal footing, so I don't think we would be asked. We've been asked to kind of peer assess quality impact assessments in the Equalities strategic group that we participate in, but certainly not around recruitment practices.
Thank you, that's helpful. And Ruth, can I come to you now, please?
I'll start on the positive action point, and just to reiterate everything that's been said on that. There's definitely fear from employers of getting it wrong, which leads to a reluctancy to even attempt positive action measures, and it really remains an underutilised aspect of the Equalities Act. I think that was highlighted in the Equal Opportunities Committee inquiry in 2016 as well, and there hasn't been much progress since then on the use of positive action measures. And I think there's definitely a role for the Scottish Government in encouraging employers to use positive action measures and highlighting that this is a legal thing that you can do in order to address underrepresentation. I would highlight that we do often see well-intentioned positive action measures which actually inadvertently funnel BME women into low-paid, undervalued work where they're already concentrated. So encouraging BME women to apply for care work or cleaning work, for example, rather than using positive action as a means to address BME women's underrepresentation in senior roles, for example. So I think the design of those programs is really important. We do work with public bodies and provide guidance to public bodies. That's my colleague Lindsay that leads on that, so I'm not sure if we've done anything specifically on recruitment, but we do have a range of guidance on the Close the Gap website, which we do provide to public bodies. We do provide advice around that guidance as well. I know most recently that we've sent the recruitment guidance to the Scottish National Investment Bank, because I know they're trying to recruit a more diverse workforce than we see in financial services as a whole. So we've been encouraging them to use that guidance in designing their recruitment practice. To be brief, there's lots of actions that public bodies can take around recruitment, so using standardised and robust applications, providing applicants with reasonable information about the role, ensuring that your recruitment panels have ethnic minority representation and gender balance, and providing training for the people on recruitment panels to ensure they've got robust equality and diversity training. We do have that guidance on the website, which I'm happy to provide to the committee if that would be helpful. And we are in the process of designing some specific guidance on Black and minority ethnic women's inequality in the labour market. And that guidance will be for employers and include a section on recruitment. And I'm happy to share that in due course when that's been drafted as well.
Thank you, Ruth. That would be helpful. Can I go to Alexander Stewart, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've already touched on the opportunities for training and development opportunities across the sector, and these require to be really quite vital to ensure that we have a diverse workforce. And that workforce is stimulated by all of that. But when we have asked and seen what public bodies and public authorities across the piece are doing, it's a very mixed picture. Some do some mandatory training, some do face-to-face some are online, or some are even optional. So I think that the success that has been achieved through some of that is because they have a programme of training and development across the piece, and it allows a tailored best management and leadership development. So I would like to ask the panel their views on that, because it would appear that at the moment we don't even have what I would term a basic minimum standard across the whole of these public bodies to ensure that training is vitally important to get that diverse workforce that we all need.
Thank you, Alexander. Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just please clarify the questions about kind of training related to equality for internal staff, but also that relating to the response of organisations to then recruit in a kind of equal way?
I think the questions about the staff that are in the organisation already, making them well enough trained, that bit about employability, I suppose, that somebody mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I really liked, thanks for the clarification and the question. Yeah, I really like that concept of employability, and I hadn't come across that yet and before, and I think maybe there's real potential for that to be used in a way that maybe the third sector organisations and community organisations can maybe come together and do a bit of that accountability themselves. But anyway, yeah, back to the question. I think the point is a good one, that training is often a bit ad hoc and piecemeal. Again, it's possibly become a bit tick boxy in some public bodies. Yeah, we definitely have concerns that, you know, people who should be getting trained on equality issues aren't being trained. So yeah, I think a minimum standard would be a start. I think there's also a danger that those types of trainings, without that culture change, without that leadership, without that understanding and discussions and the context that they require, if they're standalone, then, you know, they either won't make a lot of difference, and potentially they can be damaging, I think, to equality, because you get that kind of backlash of being forced into doing something and also, yeah, just I think it also puts people in difficult positions who are from minority backgrounds themselves. So yeah, I think it has to be part of a holistic programme, part of leadership, which people have spoken about already, and that has to be built into the culture and not just a tick box. Thanks.
Thank you. Silence.
Thanks, Convener. Again, Alexander, I think that's a very important question. I think what some of the sentiments Dave has mentioned, I do share those. I will probably just expand a little bit by saying staffing is a process that encompasses recruitment, employment, promotion, and retention. And again, all these aspects have to be taken into consideration, because we are having BME, lack of BME component within the staff complements of these organizations is because either of these four, or probably all of them, have been missed on. The recruitment process has not been done in a way that creates an enabling environment for that entrance to be made. Maybe the entrance has been made, but in terms of the employment, what are the support structures which exist? Somebody talked about the barriers, for example, people face. It doesn't mean that when you've been employed today, the language barrier has been removed. It still exists. What are the support structures are available to you as a member of staff entering that organization where the BME element is lacking, as in most of these organizations? And then in terms of the promotion side, a lot of BME people, they find it very difficult to progress within the ranks once they are within the organization. Again, what are the organizations doing to support BME staff to be promoted and to stay when they've scaled up within the ladder? And then in terms of the retention, obviously, again, how do we retain BME staff where they are finding it difficult to adapt to that environment? They are finding it very difficult to go along the culture within the organization. Maybe they are feeling out of place. I mean, how do we support them to remain in that employment? And then the other aspect is that most of these organizations, because they are not diverse, they don't have the BME element, especially at the top level. When they're having high-level meetings, whether board meetings, executive meetings, they don't have the BME element. So the other thing they can do to bridge that gap is to outsource that BME input from organizations like our own organization or all these other organizations here represented. I think that's where they can help their training systems to make sure they have some of the key aspects within that training. Well, some of this training that we have in these organizations is very much off-the-shelf training. They just take it from the shelf. It's not compatible with the requirements of the diversity that they need to bring within their organizations. Some of the training has just been standardized, to meet general training requirements. It needs to be more specific, more tailored to cater for the needs and the requirement for BME staff. I think the last point I'll make is the culture of having go-to organizations who are engaged regularly by these public bodies, but some of the go-to organizations may not have the requisite, expertise that may be required to allow them to improve on their.
Silence. Apologies for interrupting you. I'm going to pause you there so that I can get reflections from the rest of the panel on training, and we'll come back if there's any time. I suspect we're running over. Your contributions are all very valuable. We're a little short of time now, though. Dilraj, can I come to you on Alexander's questions around training the existing workforce, please?
Thank you, convener. So I think as we have different functions within an organization and different roles within the organization, so should the training be. One training for all doesn't serve the purpose, because that just addresses a minimum basic standard an organization needs to deliver on. But when you talk of managers, when you talk of recruitment panels, when you talk of members on the board of the organization, they all have different functions, and their understanding of equalities then would come in from the roles they're playing in the organization. So my first recommendation would be to have training contextual to the roles within the organization. Secondly, training should be set in the context of reporting mechanisms as well within the organization. So while we are training staff, are there spaces within practice where people who feel discriminated or feel that they're not being heard, do they have a safe space to air their concerns? Because training in itself would not build the capacity. It's about being able to enable having an enabling environment where people feel free to speak about the issues, and sometimes, especially with managerial roles or senior roles, if there are issues in the organization and if there's issues with one's manager, then there's no space, and HR necessarily wouldn't have the capacity to understand those issues. So having a reporting mechanism which is separate from the roles which are being delivered. Third, which Silence has touched upon, is also have some sort of external audit on the training. And organizations like ourselves, third sector organizations who are actively not partnered with, we have the expertise and necessarily not the resources. We'd be happy to provide insights as to whether that training is actually fit for purpose. So regular external audits of whether this training is actually delivering on what it's meant to. And last point would be around staff attrition and staff progression. As with, labor workforce, people just kind of leave jobs. So it's about regularly reviewing whether the staff in the organization have been upskilled and are aware of their basic duties and kind of go beyond that. But also look at staff progression from the point of view of BME staff progression. So if we have certain, BME employees in the workforce, are they progressing? Are they leaving? Why are they leaving? So part of the exit interview process can also be about, it's kind of just goes wider than just training. It's about bringing those elements into the process as well.
Thank you, that's helpful. Laurie, do you have anything to add to these points?
I echo much of what the panel has already said, actually, just in terms of the danger of standardised kind of tick box exercises with regards to training, and it needing to take place within a wider context where you can see a culture is changing. But I think there is something in that kind of, as the term that Dilraj used in terms of external audit, whether there is a need to consider like a charter mark or a standard. And like in the third sector, we use the Good Governance Award, for example. Is there something that we could co-create with a range of different organisations and stakeholders that we could evaluate and assess the merit of some of that training? There's always the concern that myth busting is the approach that's used, and which we all know actually just reinforces. The only other comment I would really add is I think we're all aware that we can put as many training workshops and sessions, etc., in place as we like, but actually perception is built on relationships and dialogue and that kind of essence of reciprocity. And I think if you're forced to attend a session on diversity, it's probably meaningless unless you're able to have conversations and engagement with people who are diverse or hold different perspectives and worldviews, etc. So that I'm not sure how valuable an exercise that equalities training is.
Okay, thank you. Ruth, can I come to you for any further comments you wish to add on that point?
Yeah, so we know that unconscious bias training is used on quite a widespread basis, but that such training alone is really insufficient, mostly because it's often a one-off piece of training, maybe when you join an organisation, and it is seen as quite tokenistic and a tick box exercise. And as Dilraj has said, the content of that training is very rarely reviewed or updated. And I think the external audit point is very important, and also surveying BME people within your organisation to ask if they think this training is insufficient, and using that expertise is really important. What we also see with unconscious bias training is the 9 protected characteristics being lumped together, and very little differentiation in understanding that the causes and experience of inequality, and therefore the solutions for these individual protected groups, is different, and that needs to be highlighted. And indeed, there's a push to treat BME people as a homogenous group as well, and not recognising that there will be different experiences based upon race or ethnicity, gender or religious group. So I think that there is maybe a place for unconscious bias training, but it can't be the only type of training. And as Dilraj has said, it's really important that you have specific training for those who are involved in recruitment, those who are involved in handling complaints, those who make decisions on training and development opportunities, and for line managers. I think the other thing I will highlight very quickly is that we often see that people within the organisation don't know their role in tackling racism, and that should be a really important part of this training. So while 72% of our respondents had experienced racism, only 52% of them chose to report their experience. And of those who did report, only 23% were satisfied with the way in which their complaint was handled. And they had a lot of fear around their line manager not believing them, their HR representative maybe trying to minimise their experience. And there was a sense that HR representatives could deal with implicit, obvious, overt forms of racism, but that more implicit bias. And this, one of our participants described it as an insidious drip effect of being undermined in the workplace. That HR representatives were less able to deal with that more covert forms of racism, that maybe weren't those explicit ones that you would expect. So I think it's really important that HR representatives understand the different forms that racism might take within the workplace, so that they're able to tackle all of those head on.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And can I bring in Alec Hamilton for our final question of this session?
No, you can mean it's a very specific point. I was very taken with Silence's comments at the top of the meeting about the fact that we first became aware of institutional racism properly with the Stephen Lawrence report 20 years ago, but there have been inquiry after inquiry after inquiry, and we are getting to that stage of inquiry fatigue. Can I just ask, I mean, we as a committee took a bill through this Parliament this session on gender representation on public boards, and we did that because we recognised that cultural bias stems from the boardroom. And I just want to know if the panelists believe that we should be legislating, perhaps in a similar way, obviously not in an identical way, because I don't think it would be practicable in the Scottish context to have gender representation or ethnic minority representation on every public board in Scotland in a meaningful way. But should we be legislating for some of these affirmative levers in our society?
I'll go to Dave first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a kind of probably need a little bit more time to reflect on that. But yeah, I don't see why there shouldn't be a similar approach to ethnicity and ensuring diversity on boards. I think that it is true that that it sends an important message from the top about what equality means in an organisation. But B, I also think that the speed of change is quicker. It's possible to make change happen more quickly at a board level than it is in terms of the employment throughout an organisation. And so I think in some ways it's quite a quick win and actually can start the ball rolling quite effectively within an organisation. So yeah, I think that's worth exploring that idea further. Thanks.
Thank you. Silence, please.
Thanks, Alex. I think, again, it's a very, very important question to wind off the session. I think my take on that is that one of the downsides of the Equality Act 2010 has been that it amplified, these other inequalities, and as a direct outcome of that, the racial equality aspect has been drowned by other competing equalities like the gender equality. That's why we've seen a lot of progress made, especially all these boards that we've been scrutinizing. Most of them are doing really well on gender representation. The legal profession in Scotland, I mean, the gender aspect of that has been progressively embedded, which is great. I think you're quite right. We need to go back to the drawing board in terms of the Equality Act 2010. We need to look at how it has allowed, this very, very disturbing lack of diversity and equality that we have, the racial element of it. We have to be very specific. This is the racial equality which is lacking. But I'll put the ball squarely on the feet of the Scottish government. When it comes to the appointments, public appointments, there is no single appointment to public bodies, the boards that doesn't go through the desk of a Scottish government minister. They need to start sending back these recommendations when they come on their desk to say, what, is this the best you can do? If you looked around the whole of Scotland, is this all you have only found? They need to be doing that to these people who make those recommendations before they sign them up as appointments. I think that's my take, but we really need to do a very, very serious soul searching in terms of the legislative aspect and see where the law has allowed, this situation that we now have to obtain.
Thank you. And can I go to Dilraj, please?
I'm not sure how to respond to that. For me, in terms of legislation, yes, it would, especially coming with an intersectional lens with gendered and BME context, I think, yes, it would create an opportunity. But for me, the bigger concern is to get representation at that level. There's a whole journey that needs to be crossed. And I think we are talking not just about the goal, but also about the journey. And if we can look at influencing change at that level right away, public board recruitment is the quickest way to do it. But does that then resolve the issues along the employability pipeline? So I would be open to the idea, but not sure that that's a silver bullet, a start perhaps. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Laurie, please.
I come here wearing two hats. So I manage the Minority Communities Hub, but I also manage the third sector interface for Perth and Kinross. So thinking about kind of diversity and of board level recruitment, it's a broader issue. And I think my concern would be that if we go down a legislative route, to me, diversifying boards is all about adding different perspectives and enriching that. I would worry that we shift the problem to becoming a tick box exercise of boards looking for people who are of an ethnic minority background, but it's more of the same. To me, diversity is about adding different perspectives, different ideas, different positions. But I think there's a bigger issue there for me. But I think also it would depend on whether individuals see board opportunities as something that is accessible to them. So it comes back to that culture issue that we've spoken about a lot today.
Thank you, Laurie. And finally, Ruth.
Yeah, I would just echo what's been said, that I don't think that alone would obviously be enough to tackle the issues that we've spoken about today, but that representation is probably a positive development if that was something that could be developed through that legislation. But it's also about exploring the experience of BME people when they are on boards. And it's highly likely that some of the boards that BME individuals would be joining, they might be the only person from an ethnic minority on that board. And what's their experience when they're there? Are their contributions valued as much as the other people on that board? Because that's something that came out of our research, that people often feel that their contributions are minimised or not taken seriously. And I think there's the gender recognition on boards is a positive development as well, but we need further action around tackling occupational segregation in the labour market, which remains one of the main causes of the gender pay gap. So yeah, it's about having a range of measures and also looking at how we can tackle BME women's concentration in low-paid and undervalued work, and encouraging them into other types of leadership roles and into other types of promotion opportunities as well. So perhaps it could be one of a range of measures, but definitely perhaps not the most important or the only one that would have to be forwarded.
Thank you, Ruth. And that draws our first panel session to a close. Can I thank you all very much for your evidence? I know that the committee will have found it very valuable. If there's anything that you didn't get the opportunity to say, or we didn't ask, or you wish to give us more information, then please do feel free to send that on through email. So thank you so much for taking part. If I can ask you to wait for broadcasting, to switch off your video and microphone, you're then of course free to leave the meeting, and you can continue watching on Scottish Parliament TV if you wish to do so. We'll now briefly suspend the meeting while broadcasting set up panel 2. Welcome back, and can I welcome our second panel this morning, Tom Hughes, Senior Corporate HR Officer, Glasgow City Council, Kath McCormick, HR Manager, East Renfrewshire Council, and Stuart Oliver, Senior Manager, Economic Development and Communities, Stirling Council. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, and thanks for your patience. I'll quickly repeat how this session will continue. Members will ask questions. If a question is directed at a specific witness, the member will identify that witness. Otherwise, we'll work to the order in which the witnesses appear on the agenda. I would ask everyone to keep their questions and answers as succinct as possible. And if you give broadcasting a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question or provide an answer, that will make sure that we hear all you have to say. If I may start this morning, I'd like to ask what the impact of COVID-19, the lockdown, the evidence that Black and minority ethnic communities have been affected to a greater extent by that, and also the increase in public awareness around racial inequality with the Black Lives Matter movement have meant for employment in the short term, and how do we plan for the medium and long term? Has your organisation made any specific planning for your minority ethnic staff to take account of COVID-19? And if I could go to Tom Hughes first, please. Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to take part this morning. It's been really interesting to hear the points that have been raised by the first panel. In terms of COVID-19, there has been a specific impact, obviously, in relation to BME workforce. As an employer, what we've done is we've made sure that our risk assessments from a BME perspective take into account COVID-19, given the fact that that there is evidence there that BME people are far more adversely affected. What we are trying to do is to continue with the activity that we have taken. It was interesting to hear a lot of the points that were raised this morning from members about what public bodies can do. It was also a relief to see that some of the actions that they're recommending or think that should happen, we are actually taking in Glasgow, and perhaps I'll get an opportunity later to provide a bit more detail about that. So at the moment, we are trying to continue the work that we're doing in relation to the BME recruitment activity. Obviously, it is more challenging just now with the lockdown restrictions and things in place, but we're continuing to work with our BME partners to see how we can mitigate any impacts and understand from those BME partners what are those impacts. We, as an employer, have identified 10 organisations across Glasgow who are mainly third sector organisations. For example, with the Bridges Programme, Scottish Refugee Council, we do work with Amina, Raising and Brighter, Path Scotland. So again, we do actually engage with them to understand what is actually happening out there in those BME communities. I think when we first looked at what are we going to do to increase our BME representation, our statistics are in the public domain. It's clear that if BME people apply to work with us, they're less likely to be appointed. They're also less likely to stay with us for more than a year. And if they do stay with us for more than a year, they stay with us for 20 years. So what we've tried to do is to look at the wider picture of what is that actual employee experience that's happening there, and what can we do to understand that full experience from the start of recruitment right through to progression and also leaving employment. So we have been working with these specific BME organisations to understand that, and from a COVID perspective, we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. You mentioned risk assessment there and keeping your BME, your existing workforce, safe. I wonder if you could give us a flavour of what sort of changes or things that the Glasgow City have done to take into account that additional risk that they face.
Yeah, obviously each case is taken on a case-by-case basis, so we have a standard risk assessment that we have there. Depending on the job that they're doing, each of our managers, we have basically said that our managers have to have those discussions with employees on a face-to-face basis to make sure that we're taking into account what those concerns are, because we can't assume how people feel, the media speculation around that and how that's making our BME workforce feel. We also have a BME network, so we've been doing some work with the BME network to try and make sure that that message gets out there, and we've involved members of our BME network and we have a senior leadership sponsor who's a director in one of our areas who is BME, and he has been involved in all the discussions in terms of how we make sure that what we're doing is appropriate and fitting to support the workforce.
I think the committee would be interested to hear specific examples. I wouldn't expect you to be able to necessarily pluck them off the top of your head, but perhaps you could follow up in writing with some examples of actions.
Yes,
Thank you. And can I go to Kath McCormack, please, for that first question?
Thank you. Good morning. So COVID-19 has affected some of the events that we had planned in terms of recruitment and engagement with our ethnic minority communities. We did have a number of events planned which had to be put on hold. So what we've had to do is look at adopting different ways of engagement. So we've been looking at our recruitment practices so rather than have the drop-in sessions that we may have had previously, look at holding more kind of virtual or telephone, or just looking at different methods, because we obviously want to ensure that we're keeping our staff safe and also the community safe. In terms of the medium and long term, it was very interesting to hear from the first panel just on the whole Black Lives Matters and the BME recruitment, because data is definitely something that we need to focus on. We need to look at the application data, the recruitment data at every stage, just to really understand, where we can perhaps take more positive action. Because again, I think one of the questions around positive action was very interesting, because I think as a local authority, we are keen to take action, but what we would need, I think, is practical guidance about making sure that we do it in the right way.
And I would assume, Kath, your local authority holds data about ethnicity of your employees.
It does. What we find is we use a common recruitment platform called My Job Scotland, and it's very difficult for us to actually get data at each stage of the application process from say a standard report. What we would have to do is go into each individual application and first of all hope that the applicant has actually provided that data, because in a lot of instances they don't, and then somebody would have to manually go through application forms. So we have been feeding back into My Job Scotland to ask, this is the sort of information that we do need to gather.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Stuart, Oliver, can I come to you, please?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning. Good morning to the members of the committee and to my colleagues from Glasgow and East Renfrewshire. So in terms of what we're doing for our own staff, then just to echo Tom's point in terms of internal risk assessment. Now, there's obviously a range of demographics within the staff group that have different needs and risk factors related to COVID-19. So a very individual and tailored risk assessment is undertaken, and that where issues or increased risk are identified, then we're very much following public health advice on the best possible measures to protect those staff. In terms of the wider impact on the BME community within the communities, in terms of employment and opportunity, I think that's still very early to say. I think we're going to see the impact of that a little further down the line. I think very much we're still in a phase where we're reacting to things, and the real impacts have yet to be fully known. So I think the increased challenge is fairly obvious, as with all vulnerable groups or minority groups. We're going to see impacts there, but I think we're a little further down the line before we actually see how that's going to manifest itself in terms of stats and data.
Okay, thank you. Go to your questions, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. The panel might have seen from the previous session here, the discussion around institutional racism and the role that plays, and put that from the wrong angle, if you like. I'm wondering, the panel members here can tell us whether you consider institutional racism to be a factor when you're developing recruitment policies. I suppose what I'd be trying to get out here, are you upfront about that? Do you recognise that it's an issue? And have you done anything to try and address it? Thanks.
Tom, I could come to you, please.
I think our statistics show that we do have issues in terms of less BME people apply to work with the organisation, and if they do apply to work with us, then their chances of getting through to appointment stage are less. We look at it as a wider spectrum in terms of what we can do to help to understand the experiences of those applicants. We have worked with the organisations to develop specific training programmes. So in terms of positive action, we are taking positive action. What I would reiterate is a point that Kath made around the nervousness of positive action from a BME perspective. The Equality Act obviously allows specific positive action from a disability perspective in line with disability confidence. However, from a BME perspective, it's up to organisations to objectively justify what they're doing, which then gives some nervousness to the full organisation and the management of the organisation about, is what we're doing actually appropriate and can we objectively justify that? I suppose in Glasgow what we've tried to do to reduce that is to first of all work with a number of organisations who run employability programmes. So we actually work alongside them to where we have high volume recruitment. We have said, okay, so we've got this is the areas where we're recruiting, and these are the types of jobs that we've got. So let's work alongside you to look at how we can assist your people on your employability programme through our employment, our recruitment strategy to try and get them into jobs. Some of the positive action that we've taken is we have adapted our recruitment process. We previously had competency-based interviews, so there was lots of specific example questions. We've moved away from that to more life-based experience. I think Amina were talking about that this morning. So it's more about what is it you do in your life, what have you done there, what is your overall life experience. We work very closely with the Scottish Refugee Council as well to support asylum seekers with right to remain or right to work into employment. So to also understand what are the impacts of their previous experiences and how can we assist those people into employment. So I think that there's a lot of things that we've done there to try and resolve the issue, and I think that we would be wrong to say that institutional racism doesn't exist. I think the statistics show, and they're in the public domain, that they're out there, but it's about what can we do to help to change that overall cultural in the organisation. So it's not just about let's get BME people into the organisation, it's about how do we support them through the organisation. We work with Path Scotland on a leadership development programme, and we also make sure that BME representation is on our interview panels. So those are just some small examples of things that we do, but I think it's a longer term thing in terms of we can't change that overnight. So we need to start to do this activity to try and build that change and that culture of change over time. I think also the committee is looking at it from the perspective of education. I think the Black Lives Matter activities and the wider cultural change in Scotland should also be looked at. For example, what we teach in schools about the Black Lives Matter and the history there. The children in our schools are the next generation of managers in the organisations. So how can we start to make sure that we develop that further to help to kind of assist moving forward?
Can I bring in Kath, please?
Thank you. I'd like to disagree with Tom actually on the point he made about disability confident, because this is something that I have been thinking about quite a lot recently, that it is very clear for our hiring managers, they understand disability confident and that positive action that could be taken there. So it would be good to have further guidance, again, just around race. In terms of institutional racism, I recently had the opportunity to join a working group with some members of the Scottish Government, and this was actually a concept that they'd highlighted as one of the key factors in terms of recruitment and something that we should be very, very clear about. So I'd actually taken that away as an action to look at some sort of training for our managers, because we do, when considering recruitment policy, we do have a standard recruitment policy. that obviously mentions about discrimination and the 9 protected characteristics. All recruitment managers do have to go on recruitment training that does talk about unconscious bias, but it was very interesting to hear from the first panel just about the views on unconscious bias. I mean, we undertake equality impact assessments, but I think something that we probably don't do enough of is engaging with community groups, voluntary sectors, you know, real experts in terms of race and equality. So I would definitely take away from today that I would, you know, we are looking at our recruitment policy at the moment, that I would ask, you know, some of these groups to audit for us and to monitor and assess it for us and give us some guidance on that. And another thing, we have an equality panel which is made up of representatives from different departments within the council. And again, certainly something I will take away from today is that we should have a member of that panel on recruitment panels for, you know, perhaps higher level jobs. So we do consider unconscious bias, but not necessarily institutional racism, because as I say, that's just really come to my mind in the past few weeks, few months.
Kath, can I ask, you mentioned having someone from your equality panel on recruitment panels there. What sort of level of employee are they? That's not the right term, is it? You know.
Yeah, I would say they are, so not necessarily head of service, probably just below head of service, maybe my level, so kind of, you know, manages a department.
Okay. And the other members on the recruitment panel, what's I suppose I'm thinking about parity of esteem here when people are trying to influence things.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm thinking about perhaps, you know, higher graded posts, so similar level posts, I guess, level of post, so that people do feel able to challenge, say if it was a head of service that was perhaps, you know, running that panel, so somebody that would be confident enough. And to be honest, the people that are on the equality panel anyway do have that you know, scope to challenge and to you know, implement within their departments.
Okay, thank you. Stuart, can I come to you for Fulton's question on institutional racism and recruitment policies?
Sure. So I think, yeah, I mean, recruitment policy within local authorities, I would imagine, is largely uniform. You know, from what I've seen, you know, it's founded on equality and human rights principles and legislation, and therefore is fairly robust in terms of what it sets out in terms of how we should approach that. And to echo Kath's comments, then all recruiting managers and people in recruitment panels within our organisation need to have undergone all necessary training to ensure they're qualified to make the right decisions. I think in terms of, you know, before you would point to institutional racism, I think we need better interrogation of the data and records of you know, recruitment in terms of, you know, what were the reasons for people falling down in an interview, or what were the reasons for people not getting through. Because it could be, for example, that an individual from a minority background hasn't had the same opportunity for employability support that's open to others, and maybe that's because they're not aware of what's there, or maybe because there needs to be improvements in that area. And so then that naturally feeds through into an interview process whereby fair selection would recruit the best person for that position. So there's different levels of it, and I think you know, a lot of the chat on the first panel at some point was about data and information, and I think a good, robust interrogation of maybe the story so far in terms of some of those policies and procedures would perhaps help shed light on whether that is in fact happening in public bodies.
And why would you think that's not happened so far? I mean, I suppose I'm reflecting on, we see evidence that actually, particularly young people from our Black and minority ethnic communities are actually quite often overqualified, doing very well in terms of qualifications. And we heard from the panel there about, you know, the amount of training that people have. So, you know, if it's simply that we need to look at it and understand what they didn't do well enough to get on, why have we not done that so far? Public.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, public. I obviously can't speak for the public authorities as a whole. I mean, we certainly do that within Stirling Council. You know, there's a very robust feedback process that's looked at and feedback given on specific points, and a robust scoring system. And if we're confident that the people on the panel are qualified, with the right training and score everything fairly, then we do have good records in terms of what's led to recruitment and what's led to candidates being unsuccessful. But I don't know how robust that is across other public bodies. I don't know what kind of records they would keep.
Okay. Mary Fee, can I bring you in?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I want to ask this panel the same two questions I asked our previous panel. And the first one is about a partnership accountability event, because the committee plan on having such an event where public authorities can get together with stakeholders and the committee, and it gives public authorities the opportunity to talk about the kind of actions they've taken to improve ethnic diversity, and it gives the stakeholders in the committee an opportunity to question public authorities. So firstly, can I ask the panel if they think those events are a good idea and that you actually can get some kind of meaningful actions from them? And secondly, given the very mixed picture across local authorities in promoting diversity in the workplace, can I ask each of you what progress has been made in your own local authorities?
We could come to you first, Tom, please.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think in terms of the partnership event, it would be beneficial. As I said earlier, in Glasgow, we do already work with 10 third sector organisations. We basically called them our BME employability partners. So we are working with them anyway to understand what they're doing, what we're not doing good, where we can improve and how we can work together to achieve the outcomes for those BME applicants. I do think, so in general, I think that type of event would be beneficial. In terms of what action we've taken in Glasgow, as I said, we've developed our positive action plan. We have a BME working group, which is led by our convener for Equalities and our convener for Workforce at political level, which feeds into our senior management team. And on the back of that is our BME positive action plan. So we work very closely with a number of organisations to assist people into employment. We have adapted our recruitment procedures. We have making sure that we have BME people on the recruitment panels. We've also wider looked at the life journey of BME people in terms of what are their experiences when they come in. I think that the panel earlier were saying that quite often BME people will come into an organisation, but they won't sustain in that organisation. And we recognise that. So as we go through the process, we have our BME network. So we try to involve the network as well at like welcome meetings and welcome events. We're very open with these BME people when they come into the organisation to say, listen, we've got a drive here to try and increase the diversity of this organisation, and we really appreciate the fact that you are coming on board, and we need to understand what's working and what's not working. The BME partners we work with, for example, the Bridges programme, when people come on board and they are they're given their posts, they then also link in with them on a regular basis as a kind of touch base to say, right, how are things going, what's working, what's not working. That then results in us getting some feedback from the organisation to say, right, there's been a wee couple of blips here, and we can have all the policies and practices and all the things on paper, but it's about what actually happens in the workplace. So it means that we can then get that information to say, right, is there a cultural thing there? What else can we do to help to change that overall cultural stuff? And some of them are really small things that have a big impact for the BME people. And the other people in that work area might not even have recognised that it was actually causing an impact. So it's about how do we pick up on that. We've also worked with the Job Centre Plus Race Disparity Group, and we have done 2 mentoring circles with them. We've used people from our BME network, employees from our BME network, who go along to Job Centre Plus. They will talk people through our application process, give them details of the jobs, take them through mock interviews, assist them with their application forms, and then what they'll then do is they're helping that and they're mentoring that individual person through into the recruitment stage. And then when the person comes on board, we're hopeful that they would then continue to take on that mentoring role. We are also looking at wider what we can do to understand when BME people come into the organisation. What we do find is that they do come into lower level roles. Unfortunately, with cuts and whatever else, we can only recruit where we are recruiting, and sometimes it is catering, cleaning, home care type posts. But what's important is that we break down those barriers and get those people into the organisation. And the work that we've done with the third sector organisations identifies that a lot of BME people are sceptical about working with a local authority. They don't trust local authorities. They don't understand what the local authority does. So having the actual third sector organisations assisting us to break down those barriers has been really beneficial. So they then, when they then come on board, it means that we can then understand, okay, so what's your previous experience? And I suppose an example of that is the Scottish Refugee Council. We have people who've came into Scotland from a variety of different countries with huge experience, and they're applying for posts with us as catering, cleaning and home care assistants, which is great because it gives that person the confidence and ability to get back into the workplace in a different country and all the benefits of that. But what we as an employer need to do is to understand what is that person's previous experience and how can we take that previous experience, understand that and help to support them through the organisation. And we're at very early stages of that, but that's our longer term plan. And one of our partners that assists with that is Path Scotland, who run the BME Leadership Development Programme that's funded through the Scottish Government. The outcomes of that over the past year, we have recruited 120 BME people into a variety of posts. A lot of them are lower level posts, but there's also been some higher level posts through the mentoring, particularly through the mentoring programme. The mentoring programme seems to get us results at higher graded posts, whereas the employability programme, and a lot of the employability programmes are through AMINA, with women through the Al Mizan Centre in the south side of Glasgow. So we are targeting particular groups. But we have managed to increase our numbers by 120 over the past year. And as I said, we're at very early stages, but certainly it's looking like it's starting to work for us.
Tom, can I ask how many employees Glasgow City Council has?
About 19,500.
Okay, thank you.
And our BME figures 2.7%, our latest figures. So hands up, we're nowhere near reflective, but we're...
Sure, okay, thank you. Kath, can I come to you now for Mary's questions around that partnership accountability event and actions East Renfrewshire have taken?
Yes, sure. So in terms of partnership accountability events, I think that would be, I would absolutely welcome our participation in that. I would look at that as a learning and best practice sharing event where we could probably learn quite a lot of best practice. And I feel with the committees today and reading the papers from the other councils, this is the sort of information that you don't necessarily get to see. So I would absolutely welcome any kind of partnership events. In terms of the second question about the progress, so something that East Ren has been doing has been working with SEMVO, and that's been very, very beneficial in terms of the early years expansion. So that's where it really started, that we have a quality team that focuses on the community, and my role is perhaps more kind of, towards the employees. So it really started through that community engagement, and that best practice was shared with me about that engagement with SEMVO, and I then got in touch with them and they gave me lots of really useful guidance about our recruitment process, the fact that they have 400 voluntary organisations that we could tap into, that we could share our vacancies with. So we do that now on a weekly basis. And what we're hoping to get is data from that. So we've updated on the application form to say, did they hear about us through SEMVO? And then obviously we can feed that back and that'll be a positive story for them as well. So our main focus is really around recruitment, the application process, because again, a lot of equality impact assessments, we've perhaps not been very good at going back retrospectively and going back again and looking at some of our policies. So certainly with recruitment and selection, that's a policy that we really are focusing on. And we would like to engage with SEMVO and other organisations for them to assess, how inclusive is our policy. Our community engagement, there's a lot of work going on there with, Syrian refugees and things like that. But again, there could be more kind of cohesion, I think, between my team, the HR team, and the community team, to make sure that we are really, having a joined up approach in terms of equality.
Okay, thank you. Stuart, can I come to you now, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I think in terms of kind of partnership of events and engagement is absolutely to be welcomed. I think increasingly in all aspects of policy development and service delivery, councils in particular are striving for more engagement with communities to help kind of co-shape that activity and co-design how we operate as areas. And I think you can only learn. There's always room for significant improvement in all areas, and often by listening more closely to the communities, you get the really useful experience. But also the partners that were on panel one, I think it was really good to hear their view. And I think probably a learning point is that if I can be so bold as to read from it, that they would like more engagement with public bodies and maybe haven't had that opportunity or dialogue so far. I think that would be hugely beneficial as well. I mean, the nature of such a committee is that we have to hear about the real or perceived flaws as they see them with the public bodies at the moment, but starting to move forward and focus on practical things that I'm sure certainly my local authority, I'm sure, would be open to that kind of almost peer review, but proper partnership engagement about, okay, so where can we see the practical improvements there? I think that's something I've taken as a real positive, as a possible practical step from the first session. In terms of work ongoing within our own local authority, we try and focus on the wider employability support, and we have a range of specific interventions for BME within our community, designed to make sure that they have every opportunity. Now, the employability team is part of Stirling Council, and therefore we make sure that any vacancies that come up are fully flagged to the employability team so that they can assess, are there people that we can support to move forward, apply and be successful in those vacancies. And then that ties right back into making sure that those who are ultimately making the recruitment decisions are well trained and are fully aware of the key issues, and that we're all trying to get to the right place, which is a diverse and modern Scotland. I think that's something we take from the panel and from all these discussions. We're all on the same side in this agenda, but it's how do we keep improving? And certainly, like I say, to go back to my first point, I think greater engagement with key partners would be a significant step forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I suppose I would reflect on your answers there from all the panel about the partnership accountability event, that there's maybe sort of two strands to it. There's that bit of organisations learning from third sector partners and communities, but also as a committee, I suppose, as the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, we're keen that organisations are held to account, because to be fair, and we've heard it from some of our third sector colleagues who've been on, and we've had it in written evidence, we don't want to just be having the same conversations over and over again. And while the outputs are important and the good work that's happening are really important, there has to come a point where we say, okay, this isn't working, because it's only working if you have, a diverse senior management team or directors. Obviously you good folk can talk very fully to the work that's going on in your organisations on the ground. In your opinion, or just, it's not even, it has to be your opinion, who's ultimately responsible for the culture and the makeup of your organisation? Tom, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it would be the chief executive and the senior leadership team are responsible for making sure that the organisation culture is correct, and that the fit to support BME people is there. Obviously, within the HR area, we have our head of HR who is responsible to report that information back, and also our BME working group with political input. That's really the first time that we've taken that type of approach to make sure that we've involved our elected members in the employment activity that we're taking. But ultimately, the responsibility for that lies with the senior management team and the chief executive. Thank you.
Kath, would you agree with that?
I would agree with Tom. Yeah, we would be the same.
Mm-hmm. Stuart, I'm assuming you would be the same.
Not per se. I think with any large organisation, culture, I mean, it's a huge thing, and it's a very complex thing. So if you think about local authorities, large organisations, disparate often in terms of across cities and geographies, and I think from my experience, yes, the senior leadership team will take their lead from the chief executive, but under that, I think managers can create their own subcultures, and we've seen that, and I'm sure my colleagues would echo that sentiment. And so there's individual responsibility, of course, for any officer of a public body, but the management team and line managers have a real responsibility to show that leadership, because it is very easy to create those subcultures that are at odds with the published aims of the organisation and the leadership from the chief executive and senior management team. So I think it's quite a complex issue, and that's why the quality of training and the scrutiny, I think, has to be very, very tight, because it's quite hard. But again, I think that's where engagement with partners can help us look at those things within cultures, and how do you start to make sure that there is that uniform culture and approach across a pretty diverse organisation, because it's a really difficult thing to achieve in any aspect of policy or behaviours. It's difficult to get a cohesive unit across, like I say, any large organisation, but in particular local authorities, given the diversity of scope, and like I say, often disparate locations.
Thank you, that's helpful. Go to Gillian Martin, please.
Thank you, convener. And I do want to talk about positive action, and a lot of you have addressed that already, probably in response to some of the responses I had from panel one around that. I did ask panel one, as individual organisations, whether they'd ever been asked to give any kind of assessment by public bodies on their recruitment practices. And no one fulsomely said that they had been actively invited in to do an assessment. I'm hearing this morning from this panel that you actually have had engagement, but I just want to know the nature of that engagement. Is it a case of having meetings or downloading guidance, like the sort of guidance that Close the Gap mentioned, or has there been active scrutiny, I suppose, and advice sought of your HR policies and practices, your recruitment practices, and if not, as a result of this morning, are you actively going to look to contact organisations like we heard from this morning to get that done?
Tom, if we come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I was surprised this morning when Amina advised that they hadn't been asked about that, because we have actively engaged with Amina through their employability programme. It might just be the person wasn't aware of that. The work that we've done with not just with Amina but with our other organisations has involved going out to meet with the actual BME people who are part of their employability programme, so doing some outreach work with those people. We've also worked particularly with the Scottish Refugee Council and the Bridges programme to understand what were their views in terms of our recruitment process, and where do they feel that people weren't able to get through, which did result in us changing from a competency-based approach to more of a life experience type approach. And also the feedback from them about the BME applicants, a BME person being on the recruitment panel. We have tried to do a bit of a tracking, so when we're working with these organisations, we get details of the posts that the people have applied for, and we then provide feedback. So we guarantee to give feedback to say if they're not successful, then let's give that feedback both to the individual person and to the organisation. So that just allows us to kind of wrap that up and make sure that everyone's clear in terms of how we can further develop and support. So that's the kind of activity we've taken.
Thank you. I think Gillian Martin wants to come back into you on that. Gillian.
Yeah, I was very struck by something that Silence said, and I think it was also Laurie Hughes said as well, that often it could be, some of the things could be seen to do something rather than actually engaging with people. And some of the positive actions that maybe organisations have done have been the wrong type. I mean, has that been something that you've maybe recognise, or is that something that you want to investigate? The stuff that you've done, has it been working, and who assesses whether it's working or not?
I think it's a learning process, and it's a partnership approach that we're taking with the organisations. So we are constantly getting feedback from those organisations about what is working and what isn't working. I think from our perspective, we have managed through the work that we're doing to recruit 120 people into from VRE backgrounds into posts. We have managed to maintain employment. Some of them have been in post for quite a while now, so we have managed to maintain employment. And I suppose you're right, it is internally us in the organisation who are doing that. So it may well be that we need to work more with the community partners to see how else we can get feedback. And I think that would probably be particularly further down the line in terms of when folk are getting further into their employment. Is their experience still the same? Quite at the start of their employment, we have agreed with the Bridges Programme and the Refugee Council that they will continue to meet with the people. So when they come into post, they still touch base with them as the kind of external from the council body that then allows us to get that feedback from them. But further down the line, it might well be that we need to do something. And by all man means, the work that we're doing, I think the evidence showing that it is working, but I don't think it is perfect in any way, but it's certainly a lot better than we've ever done before. So we're always open to getting feedback and working with the partners to see how we can further improve.
Thank you. Kath, can I come to you on Gillian Martin's questions here, please?
So we have established a partnership arrangement with Semvo, and it has been more than just going onto their website. They have been working with to, as I said before, hold some events in Glasgow. But unfortunately, because of COVID, they've been cancelled. But now that we do have this partnership arrangement, we will be utilising their expertise to review policies and especially around the recruitment. But it was really good to hear from the committee one, because actually now that there's a number of those organisations that we will actively get in touch with and ask and establish relationships and understand what support they can provide us.
Thank you. And Stuart.
Thank you. I think in terms of that kind of partnership scrutiny and things, I think probably you would find, and it's obviously just my view, I think the challenges we're discussing and some of the issues would be common across the local authorities. Therefore, I wonder if there's merit in the more strategic discussion initially through COSLA, perhaps, with some of the organisations that we've heard from on panel one and others, to kind of make sure that debate is and discussion is had, at that level, and that there's almost a uniform approach to it. Because I suppose the danger is it would rely on individual local authorities taking that proactive step, which they should, but maybe in the spirit of this review and in the spirit of trying to improve, then maybe that's a positive first step, and perhaps those partner organisations would welcome that opportunity. So I think that would be really quite positive in my view, and it would probably bring these issues further up the agenda for consideration, I dare say.
Thank you. Gillian, are you content now?
Yes, thank you.
Can I go to Alexander Stewart, please?
Thank you, Convener. Can I go back to the topic about training and development opportunities when it comes to equalities and diversity training? And we heard in the earlier panel that specific tailored management, leadership or development programs helped the workforce overcome the barriers that they face on a day-to-day basis within the workplace. So what training does your organisation provide to encourage that diverse workforce to blossom and engage and progress within the organisation?
Tom, please.
Yeah, obviously, and as general, we provide all of our organisation with equality, diversity and inclusion training. As a general, but a mixture of both face-to-face and online learning. From a BME specific perspective, we do work with Path Scotland, who deliver a leadership development programme. We normally, through each year, we'll put a number of employees, BME employees, on that programme. I think the training element is only one part of what we do. Our BME employee network work very actively to try and assist to change the culture in the organisation and to help to allow people to understand the barriers and the experiences of BME people. We've had a number of visits to a number of local religious organisations organised by members of our BME network. So on a yearly basis, we'll ask the members what is it that they think we need to do as an organisation to help to change the culture. So it's not just about that direct training provision, but what other information can we provide to our workforce to help to change that culture. But from a BME specific perspective, the PATH programme is certainly what we do, and also the work that we do with our partners to try and track how people are getting on when they come on board with us.
Thank you. Kath, please.
So we do. We have a range of training courses that are available to all staff. We have equality and diversity on all the 9 protected characteristics, and they're all separate courses. What I would say is we don't have necessarily tailored courses to BME employees, but that's certainly something, again, that I would take away from this morning's discussion, that there should be more of a tailored approach.
Thank you. And Stuart, please.
Yeah, I think, as with other authorities, there's extensive, internal learning and development courses and opportunities, and where appropriate and required, then the local authority will outsource and, commission-specific training where required. I think those opportunities are available to all the workforce, and there aren't any specific training courses aside from the generic equality stuff that we're talking about there, but I think that's a different thing to what it was being asked. So I think the key thing around that is that those learning and development opportunities are available to all, but the culture that we're trying to move forward with, and which I think is in a pretty good place in Stirling, is that of a flexible culture around the workforce. So any individual with specific circumstances has the opportunity to be flexible in their work. The management are trained and encouraged to make sure that any particular circumstances, whether those are home life or cultural considerations, are fully supported and embraced to make sure that somebody working within Stirling Council can thrive and be happy regardless of their wider circumstances.
Can I ask a little bit more around that flexibility? We've heard that often our folk from Black and minority ethnic communities in, I suppose particularly if you think about local authorities, would tend to be in thinking about women, for example, care at home or these social care roles. Does the local authority have scope to provide flexibility there? I think sometimes flexible working can only be available to those of us with laptops, and obviously local authorities' workforces are much bigger and more diverse than that. Stuart, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because there's very few positives to take from COVID-19, and it's tried to say that sometimes, but what has happened there is the speed at which our local authority and I think most have been able to roll out the mechanics for working from home to almost our entire workforce that aren't front line and as you would imagine. are now set up to work from home, and that has really fast-tracked the culture we were trying to achieve, which is that full flexibility, that it's not about presenteeism in the office, it's about output and working round people's schedules to make sure they've got that right work-life balance. So that has been a huge positive that we will certainly take forward once we get through COVID-19. It's fast-tracked a change in culture that I think can only be positive for everyone who needs and requires that flexibility. So that has been a positive. So yes, if you'd asked me that question 10 months ago, how flexible can the organisation be, then infrastructure-wise it would have been a much different answer. But now we're pretty well set up to accommodate that, with the consequence that we're seeing some real improvements in how people feel about work and how supported they feel to be able to do the things they need to do and any responsibilities they may have around care and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that's one positive that certainly Stirling Council can take from circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Alec Cole-Hamilton now, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to address a specific comment made by Stuart Oliver. In your remarks, Stuart, you said that the specific data had not been interrogated as to why people from ethnic backgrounds perhaps weren't being as recruited as readily as people in other groups at interview stage. And we'd heard, obviously, from silence in the last situation that we've had inquiry fatigue. I just wanted to know why the many inquiries that we've had about race inequality and employment has never actually led to the interrogation of data around job recruitment.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that's something I can answer in terms of previous wide-ranging inquiries. Like I say, I think I can only answer from my own local authority, and I think it's probably something that my HR colleagues would be able to better answer in terms of our organisation. But I think I just don't get the impression that there's a uniform approach to that. I think there is within Stirling Council, but if you're looking at the wider picture, then I think that's where local authorities do differ in terms of some of their approach to the recruitment process and recording of that. Like I said earlier, I think the policies are all largely uniform, but I think the process is specific to each organisation will vary. So maybe there's a challenge there around getting hold of all that data and information to kind of create that picture. I don't think that's a great answer for you, but like I say, probably more one for if my chief HR colleague was here, unless one of my colleagues from other authorities could perhaps come in.
No, and I apologise for putting you on the spot, Mr. Oliver. It wasn't designed to trap you, but more to make a point, I think, that it's quite striking to me, and I'm sure it is to other members of the committee, that we don't have that knowledge. Despite all these well-meaning inquiries, wide-ranging, as you described them, inquiries, that we've never actually interrogated across the board the processes that go in and the feedback and the applications that are rejected and the interview applicants that are not successful. And I genuinely think that's a chief takeaway for me of this meeting. I have nothing further to ask, Convener. Our colleagues have asked all the other questions I was interested in.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just come back in, Convener, on that. Yeah, I must say that's my impression and my understanding of it. I may be wrong. There has maybe been work at a national level undertaken. It's just that I'm not aware of it. So maybe my other colleagues have a view on that.
Well, perhaps our committee.
I'll just need to pause you for a minute. It's nice when we can be relaxed, but it's almost impossible when you're all little boxes on my screen for me to make eye contact. So we just continue to speak through the chair. I see Tom Hughes is wanting to come in on that question. He perhaps has something to add. Tom.
Yeah, I just want to say that from our perspective, we are able to see that data. We are able to understand overall what the rates are from application through to shortlisting and through to final appointment. I think there are issues, as Stuart has said, about how different local authorities and public bodies record ethnicity information. There is some work just now with COSLA through Edinburgh City Council to look at trying to get more alignment so that we can actually assist each other and compare what we're actually doing. Because just now, if I try to look at what's happening in Edinburgh, how they collate their statistics and the information they use is different from how we do it in Glasgow. But there is certainly some work happening around that just now, which might lead to better use of that data.
Thank you, Tom. And I see Alex Hamilton's wishing to come back in. Alex.
Just very briefly, I don't doubt for a second, as Tom Hughes says, that data around ethnicity in applications is recorded, and I'm sure that's commonplace right across the country. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in was that little nugget we got from Stuart, that we never actually do the research as to why applications are rejected or not shortlisted or turned down at interview. And I would like to understand if there is best practice, and maybe our parliamentary clerks can help with us, to know if there is studies around that, and actually perhaps there is a route to understanding this problem and resolving this problem through that kind of research.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our second panel today. Can I thank our witnesses very much for joining us? It's much appreciated. As I said with the first panel, if there's anything that we didn't get to, or you wish to share further information, then we're more than happy to hear from you. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting, as we'd agreed to take item 5 in private. The next meeting of the committee will be scheduled for next week. We expect this to be on Thursday, the 10th of September. And we'll continue our evidence on race equality, employment and skills inquiry. In the meantime, any follow-up scrutiny issues will be dealt with by correspondence, which will be published on our website. As previously agreed, I now move into private session. I suspend and we will reconvene shortly on Microsoft Teams. Thank you.